When it comes to preaching effective sermons, there are certain things you want to avoid. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to share with you 7 common preaching mistakes.
Well, thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. My name is Brian Androsian, and with me is Dylan Dodson. And today we're going to give you 7 common preaching mistakes.
And before we jump into that, I just want to let you know I'm doing a small groups webinar training on December 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Just going to talk through some really practical things on how to run groups, how to create leader guides, some of the things that we do here at New City, and give you the opportunity to ask questions. So if you want to register for that, online training, you can go in the show notes. I'll also add it to the homepage of the Practical Planting website, as well as our Practical Church Planting Facebook group. Mm-hmm. So if you're on the Facebook group, you can search that. That'll be in there by the time this post airs. But on December 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern, if you want to get the replay, if you can't make the time, make sure you also register for it. Again, this will be just super practical stuff of a lot of the stuff that we do, and then give you the chance to ask questions in your context for how you could potentially run groups as well. So
Perfect.
Check that out in the show notes if you want to register for that in a couple of weeks. Now, today we're going to talk about 7 common preaching mistakes. So if you preach often, or if you preach not often, but do still preach. Or this could be not even necessarily just preaching. It could be teaching in any capacity, how to engage people well. And so this episode, we're going to share with you 7 common preaching mistakes and give you tips on how to avoid them. So number 1 is starting with information. We've shared this in various preaching episodes in the past. Mm-hmm. Big proponents of not starting your sermon with announcements.
Right.
That's just...
Right.
Because the first 2 minutes is the only time you have everybody. So if you do that, it's just they're not listening. I think I originally heard this a couple years ago from John Acuff, who's the author and speaker. He always talks about how if you go to like a rock concert or any type of concert, but they don't start out by saying, "Hey, we're so and so. Thanks for coming."
Yeah.
He's like they start out with like music, obviously music, but like smoke and loud stuff.
Yep.
People are excited. Now, obviously, we're not leading a concert, but the thing is the same. You have everybody's attention, and so why waste that on like welcoming everybody and introducing yourself? Yep. You can certainly do that. We typically would recommend starting with some sort of story or attention point, and then after that, you can kind of introduce and welcome people. But starting with information, whether it's announcements or whether it's the context of the Bible, or whether it's just diving right into the Bible, which I'm not saying you should never do that or can never do that, but I am saying that unless you're like a top tier communicator, you really need to have something to draw people in. Otherwise, you'll lose them right in the beginning. And so just jumping right into the text and explaining it and teaching it is not a wise thing to do. I know different contexts. Some people like to read the passage in the beginning. I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying if you're going to do that, after you read the passage first, maybe then go into a story or whatever. Don't just dive into trying to explain context and teaching without giving people a reason to actually want to listen to you.
Yeah, it's like I was trying to think of the right word to use while you're speaking. Obviously, I don't want to say like don't start with the boring stuff because that's, especially talking about context, like it doesn't mean it's boring, but sometimes it can be a little drier or a little more information heavy. Yeah. And so just starting with all that, obviously it's not like you can't cover it, but just starting with all that, you kind of need to give people a reason to listen to you first. And if you just start off with an information dump, which frankly, like for a lot of us, sometimes we may bring a lot, like way too much information. And so the information dump may be longer than it needs to be. And then it's hard for people to kind of hang into that when they've had nothing to hang on to yet. But if you're just going into all this information, some of which may be a little bit hard to grasp or a little bit over their head, or if they haven't been there previous weeks, they're not entirely sure what's going on, where you are and things like that. If you're just kind of dumping information from the get-go, then it's going to be hard for people to hang on when you get to the point where you're actually trying to teach through.
Yeah, and it can be hard too because, again, especially if you're preaching, like let's say a typical Sunday morning, you've been there for a few hours, you're ready, you're engaged. Sometimes people are walking in right when the service starts. They just had an argument on the way over there. Sometimes they're walking in like as the last song is finishing. Yeah. Like they just got there. Yep. And so just to dump information when they haven't like connected at all, or you haven't like had any sort of connection with them. It also, starting with information assumes that people really want to know what you have to say. And certainly if they're at church, a lot of people there, they are followers of Jesus. They want to learn, but they still have a lot of stuff going on in their own life. And it's not that they don't care what you have to say, but it just assumes that everything I'm going to say, everyone's 100% attentive. And so I just would really recommend, personally, when it comes to preaching, starting with some sort of story or attention point. You don't have to be like a jokester or comedian, but if it's something that's like an interesting story that is funny, I mean, anytime somebody laughs, people can, like, the walls come down right away. Yep. Even if it's just a small thing, something making people smile. And so I just seen a lot, in my own thing, with doing some of the assessments with Acts 29, seeing a lot of preachers, people have sent me their preaching videos, and I coach, do that sometimes. And it's just like when you just jump right in, you're losing people. You're losing creating any sort of tension or any sort of reason to keep listening, which we'll talk about more in that in a second. But a common preaching mistake is just starting with information. I think partially because it is easier. It is easier to just do an information kind of dump than it is to try to think of creative stories and illustrations. And it's not that it has to be amazing. It's not that you have to be an amazing storyteller. And it's not even that it has to be long. But if you just jump right in with, let me read you the Bible, let me explain what's going on, let me teach you what it's saying, you will lose people if you lose people compared to if you had started differently.
Yeah, it'll be a lot harder to kind of bring people back in or redraw people back in with a story once you've already kind of semi lost them than to do it in the beginning. So to start with like a bunch of information dump and then thinking, okay, well I'll bring them back in with a story a little bit later. If you've already lost people, it's a lot harder to bring them back in than if you were to do that up front and kind of take advantage of that time when you have everybody's attention.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes the information, if it's really compelling, it's different. Perhaps you're starting a sermon with statistics about something that people are interested in, or maybe the context for your passage is really fascinating, or it's a question that a lot of people have, Christian or not. So it's not that you should never do it, but if the information isn't in and of itself like, oh, I want to know more about this, I definitely wouldn't recommend starting with it.
And I think that's the key is that like it's not a never or always kind of thing. Like I'm sure there's situations in the past where both of us have started with some information because felt like it was whether necessary or it was engaging information or whatever, but those are the exceptions, not the rule. So you could think of times when, yeah, I should do this or I've done this and it worked really well. But if you're doing this week after week after week, we don't always have that much super engaging information to start off every sermon with. So eventually it's going to not work out so well.
So number one, starting with information. And then this leads us to the second point, which is also why number one is a problem it can be a big problem. Mm-hmm. Number two is preaching an encyclopedia sermon. And what I mean by that is simply just straight information.
Yep.
Like think of the old encyclopedias where it's just blocks of text. And if you come across that now, like you're not reading it. Like if somebody sends you an email and there's no paragraph breaks, whatever, you're like not reading. If you read an article or a blog post or whatever, and it's just like 10 sentences, you're not reading it.
Yep.
And what can happen again with a lot of information, which, and in my experience, this is the tension for this. It's not always, but for a lot of people, particularly if they're newer to preaching, is there again not? It's just kind of this assumption that people really care what you have to say, and so you just like spew out all this information. There's no dynamic in your tone. There's no emotional dynamic. There's no like relief in the sermon at all. And so you just lose people. And when you just share information after information after information without really practical points and stuff, and we'll talk about this in a second as well. The problem is you lost people and then you don't invite people back in. So part of the reason why I try to have, at least like me personally, try to have at least, other than the beginning, 2 or 3 other stories or illustrations throughout my sermon. It's not just because, it's good to help people connect with the text, which it really is, but also it invites people back in that have drifted away. Because when you just hear this information, it sounds like, Charlie Brown, blah, 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 blah. But then someone starts telling a story, you're like, oh, that's interesting. And it's a really easy way for people to jump back in because nobody is 100% engaged for your entire sermon. Mm-hmm. And when you preach an encyclopedia sermon where it's just like, here's information, or you apply the text and you have like practical examples, but you don't, and we'll talk about this more in a second, make them really crystallized. Like you just say a lot of really good information and just keep going. It's just, people are lost and they can't re-engage and they don't know where you are. And after 10, 15 minutes of that, you kind of just resign yourself to like, I'm listening, but I'm just like waiting for this to be over. And I've just seen this a lot too, personally with, assessments and people that have sent me their sermons. It's like, even though I'm like listening attentively, trying to get feedback, I'm like 15 minutes in, I'm just like I'm listening to this because I have to, but you've lost me, or you just haven't engaged me at all because there's nothing interesting there. And so starting with just information is bad. It's even worse when all the sermon is just information really, and there's nothing really, there's no breaks, there's no ways to invite people back in. It just feels like one page, single space text with no indentions or space. It's just like one big block of text is another problem.
Yeah, and this can be done with really good intention. I'm thinking specifically if you're preaching a sermon and maybe as you're writing it or researching it, it's interesting or it's fascinating. And like, especially if maybe it was something that maybe, you understand, or most people understand maybe differently than what they should, or kind of misunderstood text. And I've definitely had times where in writing a sermon, kind of go down a rabbit hole, maybe a little too much, and be like, oh, this is interesting and this is interesting. And then eventually it's like, there's just a sermon of what I think is interesting facts or interesting
Yep.
points, but then when we actually like put it together, it's like, no, this is the most boring thing ever
Well,
because they weren't there actually doing it with
the
you.
part too is it's a lot of those facts probably are interesting.
Yeah.
And like given in and of themselves, people will be like, "Oh, that's interesting." The problem is when it's 30 minutes
Yeah.
of just information and there's no breaks there. It's like that's too much stuff. That's like it's not that necessarily the stuff isn't interesting. It's just too much of it altogether.
Yeah.
People are just done listening.
Yeah, and a way to really help with this is kind of like point number 2B is to have like message collab or like a meetings where you go over your message with other people. Because I've had times like this where this is in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is really fascinating, and I'm also thinking like this is good because it's not focused on me and it's not like me just trying to be funny or whatever. But this is just the text and it's so fascinating. And then I get and kind of like talk it through with Dylan and a few others, and it's like it's not like it's bad information, but this isn't engaging to people and people won't stick through it with the whole thing. It's just a sermon full of interesting information, which by the end of it, no one's really going to be still listening to. And so sometimes if you're really in the weeds of your own sermon, it can be easy to miss that's what you're actually doing. And so it really helps to talk through it with other people where they can point that out for you.
And it's not like so. For example, I'll typically try to have, other than the intro, 2 or 3 examples or illustrations or stories in the sermon. It's not like it's like every 10 minutes you have to have one.
Right.
Some of it is you just kind of feel out, oh, this is like a stretch here where I feel like if I don't give anything, it's just a lot of information. Now, sometimes the information is interesting, so you can get away with it longer.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just a lot of stuff and it's like it needs a break. And so trying to think through how could you illustrate the information that you've given, or how could you put a point in there next time you have a point, which again we'll talk about in a second, illustrate that. It's not that you have to illustrate everything or give a story for everything or that has to be every 5 minutes, but you can just kind of tell it's like, oh, I think this is a lot of stuff. People need a break at some point. And so preaching an encyclopedia sermon is easier because it's just like, well, here's what the text says. Let me explain all to you. And even if, again, all this stuff is interesting, it's just too much all at once. It's not broken up. And so you're going to lose people.
Yep.
So preaching an encyclopedia sermon, second mistake. Number 3, preaching everything with the same weight. So here, let me explain what I mean by this. This is not to say that you have to be super dynamic. Some people are really vocally dynamic or pace-wise dynamic. I mean, you should try to get some of that in there for sure. But what this is like, let's say, for example, you're preaching a sermon on suffering, and you're very just even the whole time, even with your pacing, even with your vocal inflection or whatever. And you start maybe with like a lighthearted story of maybe sometime you suffered, but it like wasn't a big deal, or it's like you didn't get a Christmas present or whatever. And then later on you're preaching, and then you're like talking about like really deep suffering, like the death of a child or a divorce or whatever. And there's never been any sort of change in tone or pacing dynamic, and everything is just flat. It can be really hard, and really it can be off-putting when it's like, man, you're talking about something really, really serious, and you're kind of just communicating the same way that you talked about, the Christmas present you didn't get.
Yeah.
And I think part of this, really these 3 go together. Part of this problem is when you preach, this can happen when you preach like an encyclopedia sermon, is because like, here's just all this stuff that happened and there's no emotional dynamic. So again, it's not saying that you should fake it. It's not saying you should be someone you're not. Some people are a lot more, their range is a lot different than other people, but it's just like, you need to be cognizant of, hey, maybe I should slow down here. Maybe I should, take a step to the side of whatever the pulpit or whatever I'm preaching on here. Maybe I should slow down here. Maybe I should speed up here or whatever. It's just can be really hard when the whole sermon is just the same dynamic level and the same pacing. And therefore, even if you're not trying to communicate, what it does communicate is everything is equal weight. And it can be, you can just lose people that way. It could be hard to hear. It's like, man, I know you don't mean this way, but what I'm hearing is it's all kind of just even for you. If you're talking about some really deep stuff, it shouldn't feel the same way throughout the whole sermon.
Yeah, and this is where where the mechanics kind of like public speaking and preaching comes in, to where you need to actually work on what you're doing. It's not like a well-written sermon doesn't translate to a well-delivered sermon if you're not actually intentional about what you're doing. And I think as you were talking through it, I think of an example like Tim Keller. Like he's a very even key, like not monotone at all, but like very, very like even pacing, not super high emotion, not super low, like very even throughout the entire thing, but also incredibly engaging. And so this is the kind of thing where it's not like you need to, if that's kind of the way that you speak, and if you're a little bit maybe of a slower and more even keel speaker, that you have to completely like change it and try and be some person that you're not. But also, if you watch him, he's not just he's not boring. Like you can do other things without changing who you are. Kind of like Dylan was saying, whether that's moving around or changing, or maybe like changing where your stories are so that they can have more impact in certain places. But if you just kind of accept that I'm just like this, and so it just can't be. I can't change. You can change, but not in a way of changing who you are. But you can be kind of better in your delivery while keeping your own personality and not trying to be somebody else.
Yeah, and so again, you just want to be very cognizant of that. Like, the big problem is when there's encyclopedia sermons, because nothing is ever broken up. It's kind of like, hey, remember one time for Christmas, I really wanted this present. I didn't get it. I was bummed. Now let me read you the Bible. Now,
Right.
when you lose a child, let's say your child gets hit by a drunk driver, that's really hard. And it's just like, that's just not that. All that stuff is not equal, and so you really want to be cognizant of that. Now, some of this just simply does come with experience. I mean, you can't. I don't know. You have to learn how to do this well.
Yeah.
But part of this, especially with this episode, is like you can't just assume. One of the things we say is you can't just assume that more reps mean you're going to get better. Certainly, if you haven't preached much, it will help you, but you got to be intentional about it. And so I would just think through it. If I'm just kind of everything is the same level, pace wise, dynamic wise, whatever, standing still. Well, I guess if you have like a pulpit, you don't move on. Maybe that's fine. But it's just it can't all be the same. And that's one of the things you see, pretty often is that everything is just taught as if it's like on the same level, and it's not. And so being really cognizant that preaching everything with the same weight is a mistake.
Yeah, and this is like, especially if you're newer on, where you have to go back and watch your sermons for a while, even though it's awful, because you don't notice when you're doing it. And I've done it and not noticed it. Whereas like, oh, I felt like I was really good here, slower here, whatever. And then I watch it back and I was like, no, I was just super fast through the whole thing, and like there's no inflection at all. But you feel like you're doing more than you actually are oftentimes, and so you need to go back and actually watch and see what you're actually doing, because you can easily deceive yourself unintentionally by what you're doing when it's live versus what's actually translated through video or through on stage.
Yep. So preaching with everything with the same weight is a mistake. Number 4 is having no handles, or put another way, having no points in your sermon. So again, this is also tends to lead to an encyclopedia sermon where you say a lot of great stuff, but you just keep going and going. And maybe you do apply the text and you try to give people practical ways to do it, or to live it out. But if you don't actually like put it in a sentence, and I mean, in our case, we actually put on the screen, whether or not you do that, that's fine. Maybe you can't always do that based on context, whatever. But like re-emphasizing it a couple of times. And so how you do it often in New City is you might preach something, say something, and then I will, or whoever, but if I'm preaching, I'll kind of summarize. Here's what I'm saying. Here's the point. And then talk about that point a little bit longer with that point on the screen, repeat it a couple times. Because you might, and even in your outline, you might have, let's say, a couple points or a couple handles. But if you're not communicating it that way, if you kind of just say it and keep going and move on to the next thing, and you never illustrate any of them, then it feels like, again, an encyclopedia, tons of information, where there's really good things there. And I think for a lot of people, again, the problem I think with a lot of preaching is not information. It's making it palatable and practical and understandable to people. And especially knowing that you're gonna lose people. They're gonna come back in at different points, and so actually having like a point that you reiterate a couple of times, throwing it on the screens as well. It's like, oh, he's talking about this thing.
Yep.
And so that's what I would say is, like, if you got a lot of information, okay, how can you codify this section into one single point? Because that's what people are gonna remember. They're not gonna remember you talking on and on and on and on. They're going to remember one or two, maybe, of your points, and especially in illustrations. So this is where I typically try to put illustrations. I don't have an illustration for every single point, but this is where, if there's been a lot of information, we definitely will try to have some sort of illustration around a point that was shared maybe after a lot of stuff, so to give people a break to come back in. So there'll be times, when we're doing, the sermon review. I don't know the episode number. Probably should have looked up ahead of time. I share my sermon process, I think, somewhat recently, last 6 months or so.
Probably.
So anyway, you can look it up.
Yeah.
I don't know what the number is. So we do like something called, sermon review, message collab, whatever you want to call it. Where I will talk through my sermon, and there'll be times where I'll be like, I like, for example, I need some sort of sermon here or some sort of illustration here, and so we can talk about what that illustration might be, or other people can hear it and be like, hey, there's a lot of information here. Can you like say something?
Yeah.
And so that's the way to do it is, try to think of 3, 4, 5. I don't know. It doesn't have to be the same amount, and it kind of depends on how long you preach. But don't just give an information dump, then like solidify it in a single phrase or point, ideally that you can put on the screen so that people know here's what this is trying to say. Otherwise, you'll just keep going and going and say a lot of good stuff, but people really won't really know what to take from it.
Yeah, and it's like obviously the goal is that people will take more than our points away. So this isn't like just
Yeah.
distill everything down to one tweetable phrase and then better than nothing. You know, that kind of idea.
Yeah.
But some of this is just this is the way that we are and kind of a product of our I don't know day and age or whatever. Like we want something that we can hang on to, and a phrase. It's not like we want that to be the only thing that they remember, but it helps people have something that they can hang on to and help something that have something that they can remember. And like you said, obviously we can't. Every people's contexts are different, and if you're in a position where you don't have screens or whatever, then this doesn't apply. But if you are able to, it also when screens change, it gives people automatically refocus, even if it's just for a split second because they see a screen change, and
Yeah.
so they'll look to see what it is, and so that it helps. It's not just that once if they see it, then they'll automatically remember it. It helps for those that have drifted off to see that hey something has changed and it re-engages their focus, even if it's just for a split second. It's just another opportunity to potentially catch them for even longer. And so it's not a matter of like we just want to preach bullet point sermons or
Right.
whatever where it's like as long as we have 5 points or 4 points, whatever, and they're catchy or they have alliterations or whatever,
Yeah.
then we're good. But it really helps people focus throughout the sermon, and especially if you are accidentally leaning on the more encyclopedic sermon, it helps people kind of re-engage instead of tune you out, and you don't really have a chance to really catch them back in.
Yeah. So I would, if this is maybe a point of growth for you, I would look through my last sermon or the next sermon I'm preaching. Like, how can I solidify this chunk of stuff that I'm
Yeah.
trying to say? And again, if you can do a story around it, that's great, or an illustration around it, that's really good too. But having no handles or no points for people to be like, oh, that's what you're saying, or can you like put it in a way like you're saying a lot of good stuff, but I need you to phrase it in a way that's just like puts it all together.
Yeah.
And this is not because you want people to tweet having a good tweet.
Right.
Like it is.
Right.
It doesn't. It's fine if it's not the most awarded, best thing ever, whatever. What you really want to focus on is, I mean, I do think wording matters, and so like a lot of times, synonymfinder.com, whatever. I'm
Yeah.
on that thing all the time. It's try to find different ways to say things, but even before that step, it's just hey, how can I in a sentence or less or whatever, just summarize everything that I'm trying to say here so that people can really understand what's going on. And when you don't do that, that really does lead to this encyclopedia. Lots of interesting and probably good information, but you haven't like stopped and brought it all together at any point for people to be like, oh, that's what they're saying. Now let's move on to the next thing.
Yep, exactly.
So having no handles is a mistake. Let's see. Number 5 is no sharing of personal struggle. So this is, again, obviously this is not like you have to share every bad thing you've ever done. But it's also, hey, if you've struggled with what you're talking about, to mention it. And, I think sometimes like for me, my problem with this is not my unwillingness to do it, but sometimes I just like don't think to do it. I think some people probably, depending on your church tradition, culture and context, feel like the pastor has to be, can't have done anything bad. And so that's the tension. So whether that's your tension or if you're like me, sometimes you're like, oh, I should probably like share more of my own struggle with this can be helpful. But doing that and share how you've wrestled with this and, when it's appropriate and when you can, it shouldn't always just be, hey, this was a struggle for me 5 years ago and I'm really good at it now.
Right. Yeah.
Or even if you are better at it now, not saying that. Say, hey man, I struggled with this a couple years ago. This is what this looked like, without saying, but I've figured it all out now.
Yep.
But never sharing, hey, how you have struggled with you, how this text or this topic has been difficult for you. You don't necessarily have to do this every week. You don't have to necessarily go out of your way to do this. But sharing when you have fallen short in this area really shows people that you're trying to figure this out as well. And so no sharing personal struggle. This is also a great way for illustrations and stories.
Yeah.
To talk about, when you have a point, so you want to give it a handle and give it a time of how you've done it. When it comes to stories and illustrations, personal ones are always the best. Your own personal stories are always the best by far because you've lived it and people are interested in you as the preacher, especially if you preach often. And so not sharing any personal struggles of your own can be a big mistake.
Yeah, and this can be done obviously in more lighthearted ways and more serious ways, and they're both good. Like as long as you're being personal and being honest to the extent obviously that it's appropriate, that it's a good thing. Like none of us have it all figured out, and if you're waiting to do that until you start pastoring or becoming a preacher, then you'll never do it. But like we've all struggled with different things, and to never admit it is like most likely unintentionally, most likely
Right.
not intentional, but most likely unintentionally coming across like you're better than, and like you're up here preaching because you've got it all figured out. And I don't think most people have that intention, but if you're not honest at least about some things that you've gone through, then that's the way it can come across. And so be honest with the things that you've struggled with. And it's not like you have to, it's not like it needs to turn into a, you know, therapy session for you where you're sharing everything, but you can share things in an appropriate manner. And like Dylan said, and it's good not to share things that only share things that you've overcome. It doesn't mean you can't share things that you've overcome, but if it's only just this was a struggle for me and now I'm better, or this is a struggle for me and I figured it out, then it's like, okay, well, good for you. You know, it's like to an extent, it's like I don't even want to take your advice anymore because you're not really being honest. But you can share things that you have overcome, and but sometimes it's just in the way you phrase it. So instead of whatever issue it is, instead of just saying like I used to struggle with this, now I don't. It could be a matter of I used to struggle with this, and this was some advice that was given to me, and it really helped me. It really helped, without saying like, and now I've beat it, you know, or that kind of thing. Unless it's like appropriate in that situation. But you can share things that you've overcome, but without making it seem like all the glory is on you, or I did it and I figured it out, and now here's my secret to figuring it out that I'm bestowing upon you. But honestly, just be honest about the struggles that you've gone through to the extent that it's appropriate, and people will resonate a lot more with what you're saying if they know that you're being honest with them.
Yeah. So I mean, if you've dealt with depression, if you've seen or seen a counselor, if you've I don't know, done any sort of thing that you're talking about, being able to share it is helpful. And again, I know different traditions and contexts make it harder or not, but people always will connect with you better if you can be honest about your own struggles in any particular area. So,
and one thing, just to add, that like this isn't a struggle, but just like along with it, it helps, especially if you're preaching through, like if you're someone who preaches through books of the Bible a lot and are preaching through a more confusing book or section of verses or whatever, to also be honest about like, this is confusing, or this was confusing to me, or whatever. Because there's some stuff that no matter how good we are at explaining it, it's, especially to someone who's maybe newer to church, some of it's just weird. Like it's ancient text. It's not something we're familiar with. Most people are familiar with reading. And so if you're just coming across like, I know it all and this is how I'm going to explain it to you, but you can be honest, like, hey, before kind of researching this is really confusing to me, or even afterwards, this is still really confusing, and we're going to work our way through it together. But it's not like I just have all the answers and now here they are for you. But you can be honest that there's parts that are confusing, or that different people interpret different ways, and this is the way we're going to work through it. But you can understand that there's more nuance to it than people may think, and just be honest that the text can be difficult sometimes.
That's right. So no sharing your personal struggle. Again, that's a great way for stories and illustrations is a mistake if you don't do it. Number 6, preaching too long. Yes, just preaching too long.
Not preaching too short. That doesn't happen too often.
Yeah, I mean, again, your context, your culture, where you live, in America is different than other places, so there's no standard. This is how long this should be or not. My personal opinion, in an American context, I think most people 30 to 35 minutes is fine or is good. I mean, you can go longer than that. I don't think most people are gifted enough to do so, or maybe put it this way, are good enough in their sermon writing to do so. It's not like you have to be like a superstar communicator, but if you just are doing a big information dump and sharing lots of stuff, and you haven't like crafted it well, then that's also not good either. I think the hard thing is with two of these things, starting with information or preaching too long, is a lot of the people that you might like to listen to might do those two things.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're also very, very good. And so that's why they can do those things. And it's why a lot of people listen to them as opposed to everyone else. And so not doing that is really helpful. And again, COVID changed a lot of this, just conversations of other people, other pastors. We already were doing this before COVID because I was like, I'm not good enough to preach for forever, so I'm not going to do this. Especially in the beginning, I didn't know what I was doing. And a lot of people now are like, 30, 35 minutes seems to be what I'm hearing from people that are really good. I mean, Acts 29, so I've got, meet some people that are really gifted communicators. They're all kind of doing that now. Yeah. It's in that range. And so that's what I would recommend and encourage. Which really means like being a lot tighter on your information, because if you want to share stories and illustrations, those will take some time as well. But preaching too long is a big problem, especially when you start with information. It's an encyclopedia sermon. You don't know how you're going to end this. Like your last point, but you haven't really thought through how I'm actually going to end the sermon, and so you just keep talking and talking, and then you're never done. Yeah, and you kind of had a good sermon and then didn't end very well, and so that took a lot away from it. But preaching way too long, try to be really cognizant of having maybe like a timer somehow, if you can see that, maybe on your phone on the little where you're pulpit thing you're using, or the screens. If you have screens in the back or wherever, maybe do that to try to be cognizant of it. It's not to say you're never going to be longer. Sometimes you'll be longer. Sometimes you'll be shorter. But really trying to think of, here's the time frame that I want to stick through. It's much better to hear people say, I wish you would preach longer than, you preach too long.
Yeah.
Because I hear the thing is too, sometimes you'll hear, because I hear this too, like people say, it's just like, it's so good, I wish you would preach longer sometimes. It's also helpful to know that is the minority. So typically you hear from people that are upset, or you hear people that are really, really excited.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of assume that that's like what everyone thinks. It doesn't really think that. The people that have told that to me, they like listen to podcasts and sermons on their own as well, which most people don't.
Yeah.
And so they want more stuff. And so that's a good thing to hear. I wish you would preach longer. Maybe that should be a goal. I want someone to tell me that. In this next calendar year, my goal is I want someone to say, I wish I would preach longer.
But don't take their advice.
But don't take their advice. But it means, hey, you might have thought about this. And so, again, we've done it at Acts 29 assessments. It's changing now, but in the past it's been like you have 20 minutes, and some guys come in there and they do it, and some guys come in there and they don't. And they're like, well, I don't know, I preach 20 minutes, and I'm like, I don't care. You give an assignment.
Yeah.
Do what you were asked. Anyway, that's just me. But they're like, yeah, I normally preach like twice this. And I don't say anything, but I'm like, man, 20 minutes was enough. Yeah. I wouldn't want to listen to you for 40 or 50 minutes because you haven't worked on some of these things we're talking about in this example. And so preaching too long, all that to say, is a problem. I would try to be really cognizant of the timing and timing yourself and making sure you're staying within an appropriate amount of time.
Yeah. So as a new preacher, if you're listening to this, that means preach your sermon before you preach your sermon. So what that means is have a time where you actually, in front of a few people, preach a sermon like you're actually going to preach your sermon, especially if you're coming up to like your first one or your first couple or something like that. Preach it out loud, not just like, I'm going to talk about this, but actually as much as possible what you plan to say, and have someone or time it yourself and see how long it is. And you're going to go, and in reality, when it comes to real life, it's going to be shorter than what you're thinking it's going to be. Like you're going to talk faster than you're expecting, but you can get a ballpark of where you are. After you're doing it for a while, you get an idea of, X amount of notes, or you kind of know how long your sermon is going to be based on what you're prepping. But when you're first starting off, you could prep a 10-page sermon and give it in 15 minutes, like it just depending on your delivery, or you could prep a 2-page sermon and give it in 40 minutes. And so you need to learn kind of yourself and how you do this. And so you're not going to learn that unless you're practicing ahead of time or just winging it, getting up in front of people and seeing how it goes, which maybe that's what you want to do. But if you want to learn how to kind of figure out how long you're actually going, give it like a real sermon to just a handful of people that are willing to come and listen to you stumble through it. And so you get an idea of this is how long it actually is. And then maybe take like 5 minutes off of it, because you're going to talk way faster in front of a crowd of people. Yeah. But that can be a way to start.
Yeah. So again, I think that's really helpful, is preaching in front of people. And even if you can't get people, still preaching it out loud, especially if you're preaching often. So I still do this, highly recommend. I mean, it's really obvious to people that, where you didn't even talk through the sermon at once before you gave it. It's like you would have known that this is taking forever. And that's a simple thing to do. And so I still do this, not for time, because I know how long it's going to be, just to make sure it all flows well. But in the beginning, it was one of the reasons I started doing it, was to try to see how long it would be. Yeah. Typically, when I would talk through it myself, it would be a little bit longer than what it actually was on Sunday. Partially because, you might talk faster especially when you're newer. And also when there's no one in front of you, you might stop sometimes, or like pause longer than you actually will in person, or tweak something that you don't have time to stop and change when you're actually preaching it. But talking through it out loud is one of the best things you can do. And I still do it just to make sure that everything sounds good. But preaching too long, that'll help you actually preaching it out loud, even if it's even to people or to nobody, just to get a sense of how long you're actually going, and then taking stuff out as needed.
And as a side note, just along the lines of preaching it out loud, not necessarily being too long, but I can't tell you how many times, maybe every single time I've preached and talked through it out loud, I've always come across like transitions or something that I didn't think through when writing it that are awkward, or that I wasn't really sure how to navigate until I actually got there. Because if it's just like, I don't really manuscript, so like if you manuscript, maybe it's a different story. But if you're just like kind of like points or ideas, there's been so many times where like I've written them and they seem fine on paper, and then talking through it, I get to one and then realize what the next one is. I'm like, how do I get from here to here? But I didn't really think about that until actually talking through it. And I would hate to actually like be realizing that for the first time in front of people, and realizing like, oh my goodness, this is really clunky. And so it helps you iron these little things out. So just talk through everything as long as you can. Like Dylan said, he's how many years in and still doing it. Just talk through as much as possible.
So preaching too long. And then last but not least, having no tension. In other words, people know exactly where you're going, what you're going to do, and it's it just takes away a lot of the reason for listening. A guy named Mark who does a lot of the preaching coaching in Acts 29 did some for me this year. I forget how he said it this way, but basically it was something to the effect of the sermon is over when the tension is gone. That's when it's done. And that's when people are stopped listening. And this is why it's my opinion, people can do whatever they want. I am not a proponent of here's the sermon, here's what I'm going to talk about, here are the 3 points, and then you give them.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, it's like there's no reason for me to listen to that because you've already told me what you're going to say. Yeah, you're going to have detail and nuance and information, but most people only remember the points anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's like all the stuff that I actually want to hear, you've already told me. It's like listening, watching a TV show or movie and saying, so here's the plot, here's the main characters, here's what's going to happen, here's how it's going to end. Now it's like I don't care.
Yeah.
Like I literally don't care. And so this is why, for example, starting with some sort of story or illustration, talking about where we're going to go, Christ-centered preaching by Brian Chappell. I think that's what it's called.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so really big fan of that. I read that this year, changed some things for how I do it. He talks about the fallen condition focus, which is really helpful. In other words, starting with a question that you're going to answer and answering it throughout your sermon. And even as you're answering it, like not fully resolving it until the end, having a point to end on. Now, some weeks, you'll do better than this than others, but still thinking through, like, if I've answered the main dilemma to this, if I already told people, here's what I'm going to say, they don't have a reason to continue to listen. So when the sermon is over, when the tension is gone. And so if you can set it up in a way of here's what we're talking about today. And as you're preaching the sermon, whatever, you can answer it, here's, whatever. But try to always leave some sort of like unresolved tension until the end. Don't completely answer it. And having this will help you. I mean, this is where we're doing our Advent series. I forget what sermon it is, but one of them in the next couple of weeks. We started with like the point we're trying to answer. And I had my sermon and I realized I answered it like in the first 5 minutes. And so I took that part and I moved it to the end and I, put other stuff around because it's like, oh, I posed the question and it's like really answered. And then there was a lot of information. It's like, that's fine. It's interesting, but I've already, the question I started with is already answered in the beginning. Why keep listening? Yeah. And so having no tension, the sermon is over when the tension is gone, which is again, the problem with an encyclopedia sermon because you just share a lot of stuff. And even if you don't share your outline up front, which again, I would not do, it's still like, what are we saying? It's just a lot of stuff after stuff after stuff. And so having no tension is a big and a very common mistake in preaching.
And this can be tough if you're like preaching through something that you feel like people know about or that you've preached to a bunch. Like you're talking about like Advent. I would imagine it can be hard that it's like, okay, not that like if you're preaching through like the typical Christmas story and trying to, when you've done this for a couple of years, trying to do it in a way that there's new tension and even though most people probably know the story or know where it's going to end, and you're not trying to like fabricate or make, create drama where there isn't or whatever. But I get that can be tough at times, but there is no biblical story that can't have some tension. Like it's not like you need to go and find new information that people have never heard before, but you can still deliver things or write things in a way that it's not just laying out, fact after fact after fact, and then go home kind of thing. Like you can still deliver things in a more engaging way, or write things in a more engaging way. That's not just here is like, and it's not like it'd be no different if you were just hand someone an article about it and say, here you go home and read this. Like people, you can still deliver things in a way that's more engaging, even if it's a more commonly known or more commonly preached story or passage. Yep.
So having no tension is a big problem. The sermon is over when the tension is gone. Trying to have some sort of not fully resolving it till the end so people actually have a reason to keep listening is something that you should do.
Yep, for sure.
So those are 7 common preaching mistakes. Again, hope that was helpful. Some of the stuff we shared. Again, a couple of weeks, I'm doing our small group webinar, training on how small groups, how to create them, how to do leader guides, how to organize them, how to run them, how to train people. And so you can get that in the show notes, December 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Make sure you register there. Also, if you're on Facebook, the Practical Church Planting Facebook group.
Yep.
Join it. Ask whatever questions you want. And we also have resources on practicalplanting.com. That's it for this week. We'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planting.